Hi pals and welcome to a new video. I'm Kate and today we're going to be talking about some of my favourite novels that have that distinctly autumnal feeling. I've picked 4 books to talk about. They're a little bit gothic, unsettling, a little bit mysterious, and 2 of them, to be honest, leave you feeling quite emotionally devastated. I adore all of the books and authors that we'll be talking about and will be reading or watching adaptations from them over autumn, which I'll talk about as we go through them. As ever, if you have any thoughts or any recommendations on these books, leave them down in the comments below. I really do love hearing from all of you. It always makes my day. I have my cup of green tea, so we'll go ahead and make a start. Autumn, or in my house, also known as Shirley Jackson season. So first up we have always lived in the castle. This is the perfect autumnal book, and I haven't really spoke about Shirley Jackson on the channel before, but she possibly is my favourite American author. Everyone always says it about this, but it's so true. We Have Always Lived in the Castle is her masterpiece. It's gothic, it's dark, it's unsettling. This has a little bit of a mystery to it, but more than anything, this is just compulsive reading. This has an isolated manor house, and in common with a lot of other Shirley Jackson novels, it's set in a small New England town where the locals are quite paranoid. And there's a lot of kind of hatred of the outsider, all themes that you will find in almost every Shirley Jackson novel. But in the main, this is one of the best character studies you will ever read. It's also a really short novel, around 200 pages. This is written from the perspective of Mary Catherine Blackwood, or Mary Cat Blackwood. She lives in a rather dilapidated manor house on a quite isolated estate with her sister, her older sister Constance, and their uncle. They live in a small town in New England. 5 or 6 years before the start of this novel, multiple members of the Blackwood family have been murdered. They were poisoned with sugar laced with arsenic. The older sister Constance was tried and acquitted for those murders. The sisters continue to live on the estate, but they are incredibly isolated from the rest of the town. The rest of the town views them with suspicion and fear and even hatred. Constance has agoraphobia, so her and her uncle, whose health is failing, don't really leave their estate. The sisters are isolated, they're erratic, they're paranoid, they're afraid. Shirley Jackson is the queen of psychological horror for me and for so many people, and one of the things that I love about her novels, and it's especially true for this one, is that in terms of character studies or motivations, she very often doesn't give you a why. Bad things happen to good people for no reason, because that's what happens in the real world. There's no neat bow with Shirley Jackson. And I actually think that that is a stroke of genius, and it leaves it much more ambiguous for you as a reader. Like I said, that's very much true for this novel, and it's all the more powerful for it. Constance and Mary Cat's cousin shows up. He is kind of a slimy, sleazy character who's essentially after their money, and the story kind of goes on from there. This is the book that I always recommend for people who want to get into classics, because it's so beautifully written and it's so accessible. There isn't a kind of word out of place in this. It really pulls you in. The opening is incredible, but it really has, like I said, a gothic, like sinister vibe in it. I can't remember where I read this. I think it was on Shirley Jackson's novel Hangs a Man, which I also really adore. And it said that Shirley Jackson's understanding of like true horror is what's going on in people's head rather than what's external to them. And for that reason, I really do think that this is her best work. I haven't read everything by her, but I've read a fair few. This was I can't remember if I read The Haunting of Hill House or this first, but this for me is kind of unparalleled and untouchable in terms of being her best work. The The perfect short read for autumn. I really couldn't recommend this highly enough. I'm going to be reading over autumn The Road Through the Wall, which is Shirley Jackson's first novel. But when I was kind of preparing for this video, I was writing some notes, and just even writing the notes and talking about this makes me want to reread this so much. There is a film adaptation of this, which I wasn't as keen on, if I'm being honest, but that is my first recommendation, and we're kind of starting with a bang. Next up is quite a timely choice because there is a Netflix adaptation of this novella coming out in November, I believe, which I'm so excited for, and that is Train Dreams by Denis Johnson. I have a kind of older hardback edition from 2012, I think. This was up for the Pulitzer in 2012, and I don't know if you remember, that's the year when they couldn't decide on a winner, so it went unawarded. But honestly, this is as good as anything that's kind of won the Pulitzer. This is so powerful and so moving. The writing is truly exceptional, and it's really quite like poetic as well. This is a very short historical novella, and I'm realising that short books is actually a theme for this video, although it wasn't intentional. I first read this in 2012. My dad gave me a book voucher, and I went to Waterstones and had that beautiful experience of not really knowing too much about what was in the store and just going on what sounded good. And I picked this out, took it home and read it in one sitting. I'd never heard of Denis Johnson at that point. I had no idea he's kind of the ultimate like literary bro. I've reread this twice since the last time, about 2 years ago. It's a book I know really well, and every single time this resonates with me so much. It's such a powerful little book, really quite moving without getting too earnest. I do think that this is just has that like emotional resonance to it. This is set in the early 20th century, and it follows a man called Robert Granier or Granier. I'm not too sure how it would be pronounced. And he is a railroad worker. He is kind of going from like job to job. He is building bridges, felling trees for timber on the American frontier. So they're like moving out west, I guess. And this is basically the story of his life. He is on the very edge of that frontier, kind of going westwards, and because of that, the natural world is still, I would say, like largely intact. So it's there in all of its beauty, but also its brutality as well. That is a big theme of this book. This has a real like folk tale vibe to it, which I absolutely adored, and a lot like We Have Always Lived in the Castle. It's very much about like isolation and madness, and it asks some really interesting questions about our destruction or man's destruction of like nature, about change, about kind of man and like animals. This is also infused with history. One of the most vivid memories I have of reading this is when they're like campaigning under this like Civil War canvas, because the past is like really present in this. The writing in this is beautiful, and a lot like a book coming up later on, it's honed to absolute perfection because it's so short. There's a lot of ambiguity in this, and bizarrely the ending in this reminds me of, is it the last paragraph of Middlemarch, the one about unvisited tombs. I just think that this is a really profound novel, and I highly recommend it to everyone. It stood up to the test of time for me. I read this over a decade ago, and I've been rereading it ever since, and I still think really highly of this. What I will say about Denis Johnson is I have since read The Laughing Monsters and Jesus' Son, and for me, they didn't quite live up to this one, so they've fallen a little bit flat for me. I think potentially I was always gonna kind of connect with this one more because it kind of has that historical element, but I highly recommend, and I can't wait to watch the film. I am a little bit nervous about what the adaptation's gonna be like, but I think it should be a really interesting one. Right, let's move on to something a little bit lighter and a little bit more mysterious, and that is A Study in Scarlet by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. I don't think on this channel I've ever spoken about my love of Sherlock Holmes, or potentially I have in passing. And in autumn and winter, reading Victorian mysteries or Golden Age crime just feels like so perfect. I also have the same thing. I read more classics in autumn and winter than I do over summer. This is the first Sherlock Holmes novels written in the 1880s, I believe. I do also have the complete Sherlock Holmes. I have read all of these, and what I actually really highly recommend is listening to the Stephen Fry rendition of I think it's called the Definitive Sherlock Holmes, that might only be available on Audible, so apologies if you don't use Audible, but I really recommend listening to these on audiobooks. That's the best one that I've listened to. When I was a kid and through to being an adult, I read all of Sherlock Holmes, but I read them out of order. I think I started with The Hound of the Baskervilles and then just picked them up kind of randomly. I went back a good few years ago now and listened to the Stephen Fry Definitive Collection in order, and it does make a difference, I think, and I would highly recommend that. A Study in Scarlet, like I said, is the first Sherlock Holmes novels. This is a really short one too, so actually it's perfect because you can read it in an afternoon. This does take a little while to get set up because Sherlock Holmes has got to be introduced to Dr. John Watson. They've got to take their rooms at 221B Baker Street. But I will say that the mystery in this one is a solid one. And I'd hazard a guess that you'll never in a million years figure out the answer to the mystery unless you've seen an adaptation. And actually, the adaptations of the Sherlock Holmes novels, once you've read them, are also such a joy to watch. I really love the BBC one from 2010s. I really love Young Sherlock Holmes. There's so many different adaptations that I would recommend. This has an amazing atmosphere of Victorian London, a massive sense of fun and adventure, and a mystery to keep you ticking over while you read. I've actually gone back to listen to the audiobook of A Study in Scarlet. I've got about half an hour left just because I wanted something kind of fun and autumnal to read, and I may potentially read a few of them over autumn and winter. I think the whole definitive collection is around 70 hours, but he is the original and probably still the best detective, although I am a big Christie fan, so I'd highly recommend this for autumn. And if you haven't read them, honestly, I'm so jealous that you get to experience them for the first time. What a wonderful thing to be able to kind of jump into. So that's our third book. Right, let's make things a little bit more melancholy with The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro. He is probably my favourite living British author, and this is his best work. This is essentially a novel about an unrealised life. Much like Train Dreams though, this did leave me feeling really quite devastated. It was written in the late 80s, but I do still think of this as a contemporary novel. I don't know what my cutoff is for kind of classics versus contemporary. This follows a butler called Stevens, and he is reflecting back on his life and his work, mainly his time in service during the 20s and the 30s. He was a butler at a stately home near Oxford. He's also reflecting on his friendship with the housekeeper in that estate. Stevens, much like Merricat, makes a fantastic character study, and this is one of the most skillful and subtle, unreliable narrators that you will probably encounter. This is a very reflective book, and Stevens is really assessing his life and his work and the sacrifices that he had to make for it, including his sense of self distinct from his employer, Lord Darlington, and also the sacrifices that he made in terms of having kind of like deeper or like meaningful relationships. He's also reflecting on the things that he holds dear to himself, like his values or his morals. For him, that is a kind of sense of dignity and propriety, which at points are kind of really quite self-sabotaging. Stevens worked for Lord Darlington, and like a fair few of the English upper classes of the 30s, he is a Nazi sympathiser. So for Stevens, who's built his life on his work, who has been discreet and loyal, but he's also kind of fatally like compromised. This is a very quiet book. It's not dramatic. However, it is, in terms of its like emotional resonance, really quite devastating. I do like reading more reflective novels as we start to get into autumn and winter. This is also perfectly executed and is really exceptional on asking questions about what it means to dedicate your life in service of others. The Remains of the Day film with Emma Thompson is also just absolute perfection. I have When We Were Orphans on my TBR, and I really want to get to it over autumn and into winter. This was the second Ishiguro that I read. The first one was Never Let Me Go, which I also think is incredible. This for me is definitely the best, and I don't think anything he's done since quite hits the same heights as this. This may well be a one-off, but I cannot recommend it more. Right, that's our last book. Like I said, if you've read any of these, I would love to know your thoughts. If you have any of these and you are going to read them, I'm honestly so excited for you because all 4 of those are like truly exceptional. If you have any comments or any recommendations, I would love to hear from you down below. And I will see you all in the next video, which will be a July reading wrap up. Until then, bye!